A quiet day turns loud. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Mia Harris, a decorated cybersecurity specialist with the United States Secret Service, drove through an upscale suburban neighborhood. The streets were calm, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and pristine sidewalks, but her mind was far from peaceful. Mia was en route to an urgent meeting about a national security breach threatening the country's power grid, a breach so significant that its details had been encrypted and secured in her sleek black SUV's onboard device. Today, Mia was undercover, dressed in casual attire that masked her high-ranking status. Her unmarked vehicle, a loaner from a colleague, had tinted windows and lacked any identification that could tie it to federal work. As she navigated through the maze of identical streets, her focus was split between her surroundings and the detailed mental notes she had been compiling. Little did she know, her day was about to take an unexpected turn. On the other side of the intersection, Officers Reed and Carson sat in their patrol car, finishing their morning coffee. Reed, the more assertive of the two, prided himself on having an instinct for spotting trouble, though his instincts were often clouded by implicit biases. Carson, more reserved, preferred to follow orders than rock the boat. When Reed noticed Mia's expensive-looking vehicle in an area he deemed out of place, his curiosity turned to suspicion. "That car doesn't belong here," Reed muttered, narrowing his eyes as he scanned the vehicle. Carson glanced over, hesitant. "It's just a car, Reed. Could be anyone." Reed ignored him, reaching for the onboard computer to run the plate. When the registration didn't match Mia's name, but instead showed her colleague, Reed's assumptions solidified into certainty. Suspicious. Let's check it out. "Do we really need to stop her?" Carson asked, already sensing where this might lead. "Trust me, Carson. Something's off." Reed called it in, and moments later, the patrol car's lights flashed red and blue as they trailed Mia. The sudden sound of the siren pulled Mia out of her thoughts. Checking her rearview mirror, she saw the flashing lights behind her and felt a wave of unease. This wasn't the first time she'd been pulled over, but her instincts told her this stop was different. She signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, her mind calculating every possible outcome. Years of training in high-pressure environments taught her to remain calm, but a small knot of anxiety began to tighten in her chest. She quickly reached for her credentials but stopped herself. She knew better than to make any sudden movements. As the patrol car pulled up behind her, Mia watched through her side mirror as the officers stepped out. Reed approached first, his hand resting on his holster, while Carson followed, his body language less aggressive but still guarded. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Mia asked, rolling down her window and keeping her hands visible. "License and registration," Reed demanded, his tone curt and devoid of any pleasantries. Mia nodded, retrieving her driver's license and handing it over. "This is a government-issued vehicle. I'm a federal agent. My ID is in the glove compartment. May I retrieve it?" Reed raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Federal agent? That's a new one. Got a badge to prove it." Mia maintained her calm demeanor, though she could feel the hostility radiating from him. "Yes, officer. As I said, my ID is in the glove compartment." Reed's lips curled into a smirk. "Stay where you are. Step out of the vehicle." Mia hesitated. She knew this wasn't standard protocol, but resisting would only escalate the situation. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, keeping her hands in plain view. Reed's eyes scanned her, his expression hardening as he formed conclusions without evidence. "Turn around," he barked. "Officer, I assure you." Mia began, but Reed cut her off. "Turn around." Mia complied, her heart pounding as Reed roughly grabbed her arms and slapped handcuffs on her wrists. Carson looked on, his discomfort growing. He glanced at Mia, whose calm demeanor in the face of humiliation unsettled him, but he said nothing. "What's in the car?" Reed asked, nodding toward the vehicle. "Government equipment," Mia answered, her voice steady. Encrypted devices for national security work. Reed scoffed. National security. Right. He leaned into the vehicle and spotted the sleek tablet resting on the passenger seat. Picking it up, he turned it over in his hands with a look of disdain. What's this? Some kind of hacking device. Mia took a slow breath. That's classified government property. Please handle it carefully. But Reed wasn't listening. He motioned for Carson to back him up as he led Mia to the patrol car. The cuffs dug into her wrists as she was pushed into the back seat. Reed's mind was already racing with assumptions, while Carson's doubt grew louder in the silence he maintained. As they drove to the station, Mia stared straight ahead, her composure masking the storm brewing inside. She knew her credentials would clear her, but the damage had already been done. This was no ordinary stop. It was a battle against the very biases she worked to dismantle in her line of duty. At the station, the stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal more about the officers, the system they operated within, and the strength Maya would need to see justice served. The tide shift. Mia sat stiffly in the back seat of the patrol car, the cuffs biting into her wrists with each bump in the road. She tried to shift her focus to the intricate details of her current case, anything to pull herself away from the growing frustration and humiliation. She was no stranger to challenging situations, but this one felt different. It wasn't the first time she had encountered an unjustified traffic stop. But this time, the stakes felt higher. This time, it wasn't just about her identity. It was about the system she had sworn to serve and protect. Officer Reed drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as he gripped it tightly. His mind was buzzing with self-righteous satisfaction. He was certain he'd intercepted something big, a criminal operation, maybe even a cybercrime syndicate. His assumptions about Mia hardened into convictions with each passing second. To him, her calm demeanor was merely a cover for guilt. In contrast, Carson sat in the passenger seat, visibly uneasy. He stole glances at Mia in the rearview mirror, his conscience gnawing at him. Something didn't sit right. Her composure, her articulate responses, and her insistence on her credentials. It all felt too polished to be a lie. But Carson wasn't the type to challenge his partner. Reed had seniority. And more importantly, Reed had a temper. Carson had learned to pick his battles, and this one felt too risky. When they arrived at the station, the stark fluorescent lights and cold concrete walls added an edge of finality to the situation. Mia's pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing steady. She wasn't worried about proving her innocence. She was worried about how far this would escalate before she could. Reed exited the car first, yanking the door open to pull Mia out. His grip on her arm was unnecessarily firm as he marched her toward the intake desk. Carson trailed behind, his discomfort evident in his hesitant steps. The officer at the intake desk, Officer Paula Grant, looked up from her paperwork as the trio approached. Her sharp eyes scanned Mia, then shifted to Reed. "What's this?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "Suspect we picked up," Reed said, his voice laced with confidence. "Driving a vehicle not registered in her name, carrying an encrypted device. She claimed she's with the Secret Service." Paula's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Secret Service. That's what she says," Reed replied with a smirk. "We'll see how her story holds up." Mia kept her expression neutral, though her frustration simmered beneath the surface. She met Paula's gaze and spoke calmly. "Officer, I'm Agent Mia Harris with the United States Secret Service. My credentials are in the glove compartment of the vehicle I was driving. If you retrieve them, this misunderstanding can be resolved quickly." Paula glanced at Reed, her lips tightening. "You checked the car, right?" Reed shrugged. "Didn't see anything credible. She's probably bluffing." Carson's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Paula's sharp gaze flicked between Reed and Carson, catching the subtle tension. She turned her attention back to Mia. "If she's bluffing, it'll be easy enough to prove. Why not just retrieve the ID?" Mia's expression softened slightly. sensing that Paula might be more reasonable. But before she could respond, Reed interjected, because she could have planted something else in the car. "We'll deal with it after booking." Paula raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "Fine. Let's get this over with." The booking process was routine but humiliating. Fingerprinting, mugshots, and personal item collection stripped Mia of her dignity step by step. Reed lingered, a smug smile on his face, as if savoring her discomfort. Carson hung back, his face pale and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. When Mia was finally led to a holding cell, the cold metal bench and sterile environment felt like a slap to her professionalism. She'd worked for years to uphold justice, and now she was on the other side of it. As the door clanged shut, she locked eyes with Carson. His expression was conflicted, but he still said nothing. That silence spoke volumes. Back at the intake desk, Paula confronted Reed. "What's the plan here, Reed? You think she's some sort of criminal mastermind driving around a suburban neighborhood with government-grade encryption gear?" Reed scoffed. "Don't let her act fool you. People like her know how to manipulate the system. She's probably working with some cybercrime ring. We're lucky we stopped her when we did." Paula leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And what if she's telling the truth? What if she is with the Secret Service? You realize how bad this will look, right?" Reed waved her off. "I've got it handled." Paula's frown deepened, but she didn't press further. Instead, she picked up the phone and made a discreet call. If there was any chance Mia's story was true, Paula wasn't going to let this blow up in their faces without doing her due diligence. In the holding cell, Mia's mind raced. She knew her colleagues would notice her absence soon if they hadn't already. Protocol dictated regular check-ins during field operations, and her team was meticulous about following the rules. She took small comfort in knowing they would come for her, but she couldn't shake the frustration of being here in the first place. The door to the holding area opened, and Carson stepped inside, his face still clouded with unease. He approached the bars hesitantly, avoiding direct eye contact. "Agent Harris," he said softly, his voice barely audible. Mia raised an eyebrow. "So now I'm an agent." Carson flinched at her sharp tone, but pressed on. "Look, I just want to ask you something. If you're really with the Secret Service, why didn't you push harder to show your ID?" Mia tilted her head, studying him. "Because I know how this works, Officer Carson. I know what happens when people like me make the wrong move in situations like this. I chose the safer option." Her words hit Carson harder than he expected. He shifted uncomfortably, his guilt growing. "Reed isn't a bad guy," he said weakly, as if trying to convince himself. "He just trusts his instincts." "His instincts are wrong," Maya said bluntly. "And they're going to cost him. And this department, a lot more than he realizes." Carson nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "I'll see what I can do." As Carson left, Mia allowed herself a small bitter smile. She had planted a seed of doubt. Now she just had to wait and see if it would grow. Cracks in the system. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed in the background as Carson paced back and forth in the break room, replaying Maya's words in his head. His instincts are wrong. They were simple words, but they carried the weight of a truth he'd been unwilling to confront. For years, he had watched Reed operate on assumptions, bending the rules when it suited him, and Carson had convinced himself that it wasn't his place to intervene. But this time, something felt different. This time, the stakes were higher. Carson glanced at his phone, hesitating before dialing a number he rarely used. His supervisor's direct line. As it rang, he fought the urge to hang up. Just as he was about to give in to his nerves, a gruff voice answered on the other end. "Captain Morris." Captain, it's Officer Carson," he began, his voice faltering slightly. I think we might have a problem." There was a pause on the line before the captain responded, his tone sharp. "What kind of problem, Carson?" Carson exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It's about the suspect we brought in today." Reed's convinced she's involved in something illegal, but she claims she's with the Secret Service. She had a government-issued device in her car. And honestly, Captain, something doesn't add up. Captain Morris sighed audibly. Carson, are you calling to question your partner's judgment? Because unless you have solid evidence to back up what you're saying, I suggest you think carefully before making accusations. It's not an accusation, sir, Carson said quickly. It's a gut feeling. She's too composed, too professional. And her story, about being an agent, makes sense. I think we might be making a mistake. The captain was silent for a moment before his tone softened. All right, Carson. I'll look into it. But you better be sure about this. If Reed catches wind of you going over his head, it's going to cause problems. Understood. Yes, sir. Thank you. Carson ended the call, his heart pounding. He knew he had just crossed an unspoken line, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. Meanwhile, Reed was in the evidence room, standing over the encrypted tablet like a hunter circling his prey. He had already called in the department's technician, who now sat at a cluttered desk, typing furiously on his laptop as he tried to access the device. This thing's a fortress, the technician muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. It's definitely government-issued. The encryption is top-tier, military-grade, even. If you're asking me to break into this without proper clearance, it's going to take hours, maybe days. Reed folded his arms, his impatience evident. Just do what you can. I need answers. The technician hesitated, glancing at Reed. You sure about this? If this really is a government device, and we access it without authorization, it could blow back on the department. Reed scowled. I don't need a lecture. Just crack it. The technician sighed and returned to his work, but his unease was clear. Reed, on the other hand, was convinced he was onto something big. The more resistance he encountered, the more certain he became that Maya was hiding something. To him, her calm demeanor wasn't a sign of professionalism. It was a tactic, a way to mask guilt. Back in the holding cell, Mia sat on the cold metal bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She refused to let herself appear vulnerable, even though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. She had spent years building a reputation as one of the top cybersecurity agents in the Secret Service, and now, in the span of a few hours, she was being treated like a common criminal. The sting of humiliation was sharp, but her resolve was sharper. The door to the holding area opened, and Paula Grant stepped in, clipboard in hand. She approached Mia's cell with a neutral expression, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of sympathy. Agent Harris, Paula began, her tone professional but not unkind. I've been asked to gather some additional information about your case. Mia raised an eyebrow. Additional information? You mean you're still not convinced of my identity? Paula shifted uncomfortably. Let's just say I'm trying to get to the bottom of this. If you cooperate, it'll help speed things along. Mia leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. Officer Grant, I've been more than cooperative. My credentials are in the glove compartment of the vehicle I was driving. If someone would just retrieve them, this entire situation could have been resolved hours ago. Paula hesitated before responding. Reed believes what he wants to believe. Mia interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. And that belief is rooted in biases that have nothing to do with facts. If you're really trying to get to the bottom of this, Officer Grant, then stop relying on Reed's assumptions and start looking at the evidence. Paula stared at Mia for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, she turned and left the holding area. Maya leaned back against the wall, her frustration simmering but contained. She could only hope that Paula's departure meant progress, not more stalling. In the station's conference room, Captain Morris was reviewing Mia's case file when his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but the prefix was unmistakably government-issued. He answered quickly. This is Captain Morris. Captain, "This is Special Agent Daniel Pratt with the United States Secret Service." The voice on the other end said, its tone calm but firm. "I'm calling regarding Agent Mia Harris. We've been unable to reach her during a scheduled check-in, and we have reason to believe she may be in your custody." Captain Morris stiffened. "Yes, Agent Pratt. We currently have her detained. My officers believe she may be involved in suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Pratt repeated, his tone sharpening. "Captain, Agent Harris is one of our top cybersecurity specialists. She was en route to an urgent national security briefing when she was stopped. Whatever suspicions your officers may have, I can assure you they are unfounded." Captain Morris rubbed his temple, feeling a headache brewing. "Understood. I'll ensure her release immediately." "See that you do," Pratt replied. "And Captain, I trust this will be handled with the utmost discretion. The last thing any of us want is an interagency conflict." "Of course, Agent Pratt," Morris said before ending the call. The captain exhaled slowly, realizing the magnitude of the situation. He stood and headed toward the holding area, preparing for what would undoubtedly be an uncomfortable conversation. In the evidence room, Reed's phone buzzed with a message from the captain. "Come to my office." "Now." Reed frowned but complied, leaving the 8th technician to his work. When he arrived at the captain's office, the stern expression on Morris's face told him everything he needed to know. "We're releasing Harris," the captain said without preamble. "She's a Secret Service agent, as she claimed." "You've overstepped, Reed." Reed's face twisted in disbelief. "But Captain—" "No," Morris cut him off. "You had no solid evidence, and now we've got the Secret Service breathing down our necks. This ends now." Reed clenched his jaw, but he couldn't argue. The realization of his mistake began to sink in, though his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. Without another word, he turned and left the office, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. When Mia was finally escorted out of the holding cell, she locked eyes with Reed as she passed him in the hallway. Her expression was calm, but her gaze held a quiet strength that made him look away. She was handed her belongings at the front desk, where a tall man in a crisp black suit was waiting. Special Agent Pratt greeted her with a nod, his presence radiating authority. "Agent Harris," Pratt said, "let's get you out of here." As they exited the station together, Mia felt a rush of relief mingled with anger. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of a battle she was determined to win. A reckoning in the making. The morning sun was breaking over the horizon as Mia Harris sat in the passenger seat of a sleek black sedan, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The vehicle hummed along the highway toward the Secret Service headquarters, but her mind was racing faster than the car. Special Agent Daniel Pratt drove in silence beside her, his expression calm yet unreadable. "Thank you for coming," Mia said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness. Pratt glanced at her briefly. "Of course. You're one of us, and what happened was unacceptable." Mia nodded but didn't respond. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her, not because of the indignity she had suffered, though that had been considerable, but because of what it represented. She had seen systemic failures up close before, but being on the receiving end had turned a professional concern into a personal mission. When they arrived at headquarters, Pratt led Mia into a private conference room. Inside, a team of legal and administrative officers sat waiting, their faces serious. Among them was Deputy Director Ann Whittaker, a no-nonsense leader known for her unwavering commitment to her agents. She stood as Mia entered, her sharp blue eyes scanning Mia from head to toe as if assessing the damage. "Agent Harris," Whittaker said, her voice firm but warm, "I've been briefed on the situation. Are you all right?" Mia nodded, though her shoulders remained tense. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just ready to move forward." Whittaker gestured for Mia to sit, and the group settled around the table. Pratt remained standing, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His presence was a silent but powerful reminder that Mia wasn't fighting this battle alone. The deputy director wasted no time. "Agent Harris, I need a full account of what happened. Every detail. This isn't just about clearing your name. It's about holding those responsible accountable." Mia took a deep breath, recounting the events from the moment the patrol car's lights flashed in her rearview mirror to her release hours later. Her voice remained steady, but as she described Reed's hostility and dismissiveness, a flicker of anger seeped into her tone. When she finished, Whittaker leaned back in her chair, her expression dark. "This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. It's a gross abuse of power and a violation of your civil rights. The fact that you identified yourself as a federal agent and were still treated this way is deeply troubling." Pratt spoke up for the first time. "We've already flagged this incident with the Department of Justice. If Reed and his department think they can bury this, they're sorely mistaken." Mia's gaze shifted to Whittaker. "With respect, ma'am, this isn't just about me. This kind of behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. Officer Reed's actions are a symptom of a much larger problem. If we only address him, we're treating the symptom, not the disease." Whittaker nodded, a spark of approval in her eyes. "I couldn't agree more. That's why we're going to do this right. Not just legal action against Reed, but a full investigation into the department's practices, training protocols, and accountability measures." Mia felt a small flicker of hope. It was the first time since the ordeal began that she felt as though justice might be within reach. Across town, Officer Reed sat at his desk in the station, his mood as dark as the coffee in his mug. The fallout from Mia's release had already begun. Captain Morris had pulled him into a closed-door meeting that morning, delivering a scathing reprimand that would haunt Reed's personnel file for years. But the reprimand wasn't what gnawed at him. It was the lingering sense that he'd lost control of the narrative. Reed prided himself on being the department's top enforcer, the one who didn't just follow rules but shaped them to fit the situation. To him, Mia wasn't just a suspect. She was a challenge to his authority. And now, with the Secret Service breathing down his neck, he knew his career hung by a thread. Carson entered the room cautiously, his expression as conflicted as ever. "Reed, can we talk?" Reed glanced at him, his jaw tightening. "What is it now?" Carson hesitated, then closed the door behind him. I think we need to reevaluate how we handle things. What happened with Harris wasn't right." Reed snorted, leaning back in his chair. "You're starting to sound like her." "She's not wrong," Carson said, his voice firmer than usual. "You let your biases guide you, and now the whole department's under scrutiny because of it." Reed slammed his hand on the desk, making Carson flinch. "You think this is my fault?" "She played the system, Carson. People like her always do." Carson's face hardened. "People like her. Do you even hear yourself? She was calm, professional, and gave us every opportunity to verify her story. You just didn't want to believe her." The silence between them was heavy, the weight of unspoken truths filling the room. Carson finally turned and walked out, leaving Reed to stew in his anger and denial. That afternoon, a press conference was called at Secret Service headquarters. Reporters filled the room, their murmurs dying down as Deputy Director Whittaker approached the podium. Maya stood behind her, flanked by Pratt and several other agents. "Good afternoon," Whittaker began, her voice steady and commanding. "Today we address a serious matter involving one of our agents, Mia Harris, who was wrongfully detained while on duty. This incident highlights not just an individual failure, but a systemic issue within law enforcement that must be addressed." She continued, outlining the Secret Service's commitment to seeking justice for Mia and calling for broader reforms to ensure accountability. Maya listened intently, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and determination. The world was watching now, and she intended to make every moment count. When Whittaker stepped aside, Mia took her place at the podium. The room went silent as her steady gaze swept across the crowd. "I've spent my career protecting this country from threats both foreign and domestic," Mia began. "Yesterday, I found myself facing a different kind of threat. a threat rooted in assumptions and biases that undermine the very system I serve. This is not just my story. It's the story of countless others who face injustice every day. But today, I stand here to say that enough is enough. Change starts here. The room erupted in applause, but Mia barely heard it. Her focus was on the work ahead, a fight that was only just beginning. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt the stirrings of hope, not just for herself, but for the system she was determined to fix. The ripple effect. The echoes of applause from the press conference had barely faded when Mia Harris stepped back into the halls of the Secret Service headquarters. The weight of the moment hadn't fully settled on her yet. She was still running on adrenaline. She'd faced high-stakes situations before. Cyber breaches threatening national infrastructure, high-tech espionage. But this was different. This was personal. Deputy Director Whitaker was waiting for her near the elevators. "You did well, Harris," she said as Mia approached. "You didn't just speak for yourself today. You spoke for everyone who's ever been silenced by systemic bias." "Thank you, ma'am," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "But I know this isn't over." Whitaker nodded, "Not by a long shot, but we've drawn the line in the sand. Now, let's see how far they're willing to push." Mia's phone buzzed as she stepped into the elevator. She glanced at the screen. A message from Special Agent Pratt. "Intel meeting in 30 minutes. Room 203. Update on the internal investigation." Mia inhaled deeply. The wheels were turning faster than she'd expected. She tucked the phone into her pocket and headed to her office to prepare. Across the city, the ripple effects of Mia's press conference were spreading through the ranks of the police department like wildfire. The station was in disarray. Officers whispered in clusters, the tension palpable as news stations replayed Mia's speech on every screen in the precinct. Some watched in silence, a few shook their heads in disbelief, but many simply avoided eye contact altogether. Officer Carson sat at his desk, the muffled voices around him blending into a dull hum. He had spent the night grappling with his role in Mia's detention, replaying every moment in excruciating detail. His conscience had been gnawing at him for hours, and the fallout from the press conference only added fuel to the fire. Carson finally stood, grabbed his jacket, and headed toward Captain Morris's office. The captain looked up from his desk, his expression grim. "Captain," Carson began, shutting the door behind him, "we need to talk about what happened. About Reed." Morris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Carson, I've already reprimanded Reed, and I'm cooperating with the Secret Service investigation. What more do you want me to do?" "Reprimanding him isn't enough," Carson said, his voice rising. "Reed's behavior isn't just a one-time mistake. It's a pattern, and we both know this department has let it slide for years." Morris's jaw tightened. "Be careful, Carson. You're walking a fine line." "With all due respect, sir, this isn't about me," Carson countered. "It's about the fact that our actions, or inactions, are going to cost us more than just public trust. They're going to cost us our credibility as law enforcement." Morris stared at him for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "We need to address this head-on," Carson said firmly. "Not just by investigating Reed, but by examining our entire department. Training, policies, accountability measures, all of it." Morris rubbed his temple. "You realize what you're asking for, don't you? An internal audit of this scope could expose things that could destroy careers, yours included." "I know," Carson said, "but it's the right thing to do." Morris studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll bring it up at the next meeting with the city council, but you better be prepared for the fallout." At Secret Service headquarters, the mood in room 203 was tense but purposeful. Special Agent Pratt stood at the head of the table, flanked by 2 analysts and a legal advisor. A large screen displayed a series of documents, internal reports, complaint records, and training manuals from the police department that had detained Mia. "This is what we're dealing with," Pratt began, gesturing toward the screen. "We've pulled preliminary data from their internal records, and the patterns are concerning." One of the analysts, a wiry man with glasses named Patel, clicked a remote, shifting the screen to a chart. In the past 5 years, there have been 39 documented complaints of racial bias or misconduct against Officer Reed alone. Only one resulted in disciplinary action, and it was a verbal warning. Mia's jaw tightened. She hadn't been surprised by Reed's actions, but seeing the data laid bare hit her harder than she'd expected. "And the department?" she asked. "What about their broader track record?" Patel nodded, clicking again to reveal a broader chart. "The department as a whole has a troubling history. Over 70% of complaints related to misconduct or bias are marked as unsubstantiated and closed without further action." Whittaker, who had joined the meeting midway, leaned forward. "And the training protocols?" "Updated," Patel replied. "Their last mandatory bias training was 6 years ago, and participation rates were inconsistent. Most of their officers have never undergone advanced de-escalation training." Pratt turned to Mia. "This isn't just about Reed. It's about a system that allowed him to thrive. And we have a decision to make. Do we focus on exposing Reed, or do we push for systemic reform?" Mia didn't hesitate. "We push for reform. Reed is a symptom, but the disease is much bigger. If we don't address the system, there will just be another Reed to take his place." Whittaker nodded approvingly. "Then we need to strategize. This won't just be a legal battle. It'll be a public one. We'll need allies, media coverage, and a solid case." Pratt's expression was serious. "It's going to get ugly, Harris. The department won't go down without a fight." Mia met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "Let them fight. We're not backing down." As night fell, Mia sat in her office, poring over the case files and preliminary reports. Her determination hadn't waned, but the exhaustion was beginning to creep in. She was about to call it a night when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You don't know who you're messing with. Drop this now before it's too late." Mia stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she considered the implications, who had sent it, what it meant. But then a steely determination settled over her. She placed the phone on her desk and began typing an email to the legal team. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. This was bigger than her, and she intended to see it through to the end. Justice unleashed. Mia Harris sat in the courtroom, her fingers pressed together as she watched the proceedings unfold. The faint hum of voices and the shuffle of papers filled the air, but her focus was unshakable. This wasn't just about her wrongful detention anymore. It had grown into a landmark case poised to expose the systemic failures of the police department that had wrongfully detained her. On her side sat Deputy Director Ann Whittaker, Special Agent Daniel Pratt, and a team of legal experts. Across the aisle, the defense team representing Officer Reed and the police department looked visibly strained. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community leaders, and activists. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Cameras outside the courthouse streamed live coverage to a nation eager to see how justice would unfold. A department under siege. Earlier that morning, Captain Morris had arrived at the station to find chaos. News outlets were camped outside, their cameras pointed at every officer entering or leaving the building. The department's phone lines were inundated with calls from reporters, activists, and concerned citizens demanding accountability. Internally, morale was at an all-time low. Officers whispered about who might be the next to face scrutiny, their nerves frayed. In his office, Morris met with Carson, who had become an unlikely advocate for reform within the department. Carson had spent weeks gathering evidence, quietly speaking with officers willing to share stories of misconduct or unethical practices. His efforts, coupled with the mounting pressure from the Secret Service and media, had forced Morris to authorize a comprehensive internal audit. "You've opened a can of worms, Carson," Morris said, rubbing his temples. "This department might not survive the fallout." "Maybe it shouldn't," Carson replied bluntly. Not if it means protecting the people who keep undermining what we're supposed to stand for. Morris sighed heavily. You'd better be ready to take the stand. The city's lawyers are going to come after anyone who speaks out. Carson nodded, his resolve firm. Let them. The trial begins. Back in the courtroom, Mia's attorney, a sharp and composed woman named Joanna Ellis, stood to deliver her opening statement. She painted a vivid picture of what Mia had endured. The assumptions made based on her appearance, the dismissal of her credentials, and the blatant violation of her civil rights. But Joanna didn't stop there. She turned her focus to the department's long-standing culture of ignoring misconduct, using hard data to back up her claims. This isn't just about one officer's actions, Joanna said, her voice steady but powerful. It's about a system that enabled him, that turned a blind eye to the complaints, and that failed to hold its officers accountable. Agent Harris' experience is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem. The defense attorney, a seasoned litigator named Paul Givens, countered by attempting to paint Mia's detention as a reasonable mistake and emphasizing the stress and challenges officers face in the field. But as he spoke, the weight of the evidence began to erode his arguments. Joanna called her first witness, Carson. The courtroom fell silent as the young officer took the stand, his nervous energy evident, but his resolve unshaken. Officer Carson, Joanna began, can you describe the events leading up to Agent Harris' detention? Carson recounted the traffic stop, his tone measured but honest. He described Reed's dismissive attitude, his refusal to verify Mia's credentials, and his reliance on assumptions rather than evidence. And in your opinion, was there any legitimate reason to suspect Agent Harris of criminal activity? Joanna asked. Carson hesitated, glancing briefly at Reed, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. No, he said finally. There wasn't. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Joanna pressed on. And has Officer Reed displayed similar behavior in the past? Yes, Carson admitted. Reed has a history of acting on gut instincts rather than following protocol. It's something a lot of us have seen but didn't feel we could challenge. Joanna nodded, her expression serious. Thank you, Officer Carson. No further questions. When Givens cross-examined Carson, he attempted to undermine his credibility, accusing him of betraying his department. But Carson remained steadfast, refusing to waver under pressure. Exposing the system. The next witness was a civilian who had filed a complaint against Reed years earlier. Her testimony painted a picture of an officer who frequently overstepped his bounds, but was never held accountable. Following her, a former training officer took the stand, testifying about the department's lack of updated training in bias awareness and de-escalation techniques. By the time Mia took the stand, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. She recounted her experience with precision, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I wasn't just detained, Mia said, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. I was silenced. My credentials, my professionalism, my humanity, none of it mattered to Officer Reed. To him, I was guilty before I even spoke. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Reed to act with impunity, that dismisses complaints, and that prioritizes protecting its own over serving justice. That has to change. The verdict. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge read the decision. The department and Officer Reed were found liable for violating Mia's civil rights. A wave of relief and vindication washed over Mia, but she knew this was just one victory in a much larger battle. The judge ordered the department to implement sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias and de-escalation training, an independent oversight committee, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. Reed was suspended indefinitely, and his actions would be referred to a federal review board for further investigation. A new chapter. As Mia exited the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, microphones and cameras thrust forward as they peppered her with questions. She raised a hand, signaling for silence. "This isn't just a win for me," she said firmly. "This is a win for everyone who has ever been wrongfully judged or silenced. But it's only the beginning. True justice requires accountability, and accountability requires systemic change. That's what we're fighting for." She walked away, her head held high, the weight of the ordeal beginning to lift. Behind her, a movement was taking shape, one that would ripple far beyond her own story. Mia Harris knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also knew she wouldn't be walking it alone. Justice Unleashed. As Mia stepped into the awaiting black SUV, Special Agent Daniel Pratt was already inside, waiting to debrief her. His sharp eyes scanned her face for any signs of exhaustion, but all he saw was quiet determination. She sank into the seat and exhaled deeply, letting the tension of the courtroom begin to dissipate. "You handled that well," Pratt said, breaking the silence. "But you know this doesn't end here." "I know," Maya replied, staring out the window at the crowd of reporters still swarming the courthouse steps. "This was just the first step. The real fight is making sure the reforms stick, and that the department doesn't find a way to bury this in bureaucracy." Pratt nodded. "Whitaker's already on it. The Oversight Committee is being formed as we speak, and the Department of Justice is opening a formal inquiry into the police department's practices. But you should prepare yourself. There will be pushback." Mia turned to him, her expression resolute. "Let them push back. They'll find I push harder." Pratt smirked faintly, his respect for her unspoken but clear. "You're relentless, Harris. That's why they're afraid of you." Change begins. Over the following months, the aftermath of Mia's case sparked a national conversation. Media outlets ran exposes on systemic bias in law enforcement, using her story as a catalyst for broader discussions about accountability and reform. Community leaders and activists rallied behind her, organizing town halls and pushing for changes in other police departments with similar issues. The newly formed Oversight Committee began its work, led by independent investigators and legal experts. They uncovered years of buried complaints, falsified reports, and a culture of silence that had allowed officers like Reed to operate unchecked. The findings were damning, and they led to the resignation of several high-ranking officials within the department. Officer Reed, meanwhile, faced a federal investigation that resulted in his dismissal and the revocation of his law enforcement certification. He would never work in policing again. For him, the fallout wasn't just professional, it was personal. He became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked authority, and the scrutiny followed him wherever he went. As for Officer Carson, his decision to speak out made him a polarizing figure within the department. Some colleagues shunned him, while others quietly admired his courage. He was reassigned to a training division, where he worked to implement the very reforms Mia had fought for. Though his career path had shifted, he found purpose in ensuring that others wouldn't face the same injustices. Mia's next chapter. One evening, months after the trial, Mia sat in her home office, reviewing reports from the Oversight Committee. She had taken on a new role within the Secret Service, advising on interagency collaborations to improve training and accountability across federal and local law enforcement. It was grueling work, but it felt meaningful. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Deputy Director Whitaker. "Dinner tomorrow at 7. We need to discuss your next project. Big things ahead." Mia smiled faintly, her mind already spinning with possibilities. She replied with a simple, "I'll be there." Just as she set the phone down, another notification caught her attention, an email from a young woman in a small town across the country. The subject line read, "Thank you for speaking out." Mia opened it, reading the heartfelt words of gratitude from someone who had faced her own struggles with unjust treatment by law enforcement. The woman wrote about how Maya's story had inspired her to come forward and demand accountability in her own community. Mia leaned back in her chair, the weight of the message sinking in. This was why she fought, not for accolades or personal vindication, but for the countless others who needed to see that change was possible. A movement grows. In the years that followed, Maya's case became a landmark moment in the fight for systemic reform. Training protocols were overhauled, accountability measures strengthened, and officers across the country began facing stricter consequences for misconduct. It wasn't a perfect system. There were still battles to fight, but the progress was undeniable. Mia became a prominent advocate for justice, balancing her work in cybersecurity with her efforts to reform the system she had dedicated her life to protecting. She spoke at conferences, advised policymakers, and continued to challenge those who resisted change. As she stood before a packed audience at a national law enforcement summit one day, her words echoed the sentiment that had driven her from the start. Accountability is not the enemy of law enforcement. It's the foundation of trust, and without trust, there is no justice. The applause was thunderous, but Maya's focus remained on the work ahead. She knew the fight for justice was far from over, but she also knew that every step forward mattered. Mia Harris wasn't just a victim of injustice, she was its fiercest adversary. And she was just getting started.